Okay. Hey, everybody. We are getting into Chapter 6 in your textbook. As always, I am Dr. Casey Hart, and this is Media Research Methods. In this chapter, we are going from qualitative research, which we've talked about previously, into some basic quantitative research. One of the most common quantitative research methods in mass media, and one of the ones that I would suggest you guys might like to try and start with, is actually content analysis. It's pretty straightforward, and if you do some groundwork right at the beginning, it can be a really easy, I would say, one of the more direct and I hate to use the word easy, but easier methods that you might employ. Now, as always, there are some things to consider before you do any research project. For example, what are you trying to investigate? Is this process, is this tool something that is conducive to answering the question that you are trying to ask? A content analysis is a very specific tool for a very specific purpose. But in simplest terms, it is counting the number of occurrences that something happens within media. Now, this could be a situation where you count the number of times, say, a person of a particular ethnicity shows up on screen, counting the number of times a certain activity has taken place on camera, counting the number of times a certain word is used in a newspaper or social media, or a series of newspaper articles or social media posts. Any of these things could be examined through content analysis. So this is going to be a pretty short, straightforward lecture, but let's go ahead and jump into it. So to begin, what is a content analysis? Well, a content analysis is a systematic procedure devised to examine the content of a recorded information. It's a technique for making replicable, valid reference from data to their context. In simplest terms, what we're talking about is defining what is happening, defining exactly what's going on within a particular form of media. So as I said, if we are trying to see how, say, Asian Americans are represented in sitcoms, then we may choose several highly rated sitcoms and count particular stereotypes, or count how many times just Asian Americans are depicted, how many times they are used in episodes or shown in episodes. If we are trying to show something like, say, female protagonists, in primetime dramas, what we may do is collect all the primetime dramas for the last 30 years and then look at how many of them actually had female protagonists, and then maybe even break down further and count specific occurrences of specific character types. Now, all of these things are content and can potentially be handled in a content analysis, but there are several things you have to pay attention to. First off, it's got to be systematic. Content is collected and analyzed according to explicit and consistently applied rules. This goes back to what we talked about very early on with operationalization of terms. A content analysis is only effective. Excuse me. The content analysis is only effective if you can operationalize your terms in very specific and objective criteria. In other words, if you can have terms set up, if you can have your experiment or your content analysis set up in such a way as I can give my recipe, so to speak, to someone else, and they can conduct the study that I want to conduct, that's systematic. That is a sound content analysis, but it does require a lot of thought on the front end. Objective. Research bias should not enter into sample or analysis. Now, this goes in with quantitative research, okay? And going back to what you said with systematic, whenever you come up with the terms you're looking at or the concepts you're looking at, the units of analysis is what we use, or is the term we use for the things that we are actually measuring, units of analysis. So if our unit of analysis are Asian American characters, okay, so that's fine. And we define Asian American as what? How do we define this? For example, technically, if we're talking about Asian, folks from places like the Philippines or India would qualify as Asian, not just perhaps stereotypical places like Japan, China, Korea, North and South Korea, Vietnam, places like this. So if we're defining Asian characters, perhaps what we want to do is clarify specifically what we are looking for in that case. All right, so we want to clarify, in this case, particular tropes we're looking for, or maybe we just care about that whole region. And in our case, it doesn't matter whether a character is from, say, China, Japan, India, the Philippines. All of those work as part of our Asia unit of analysis. That's fine, but we want to make sure we actually go in and we operationalize this. We define our parameters. We should also take a step back and make sure that we're not writing our own understanding or, in some cases, our own biases into these things. This is where, in some cases, going through a pilot study, and as we'll talk about in a second, going with intercoder reliability or ensuring intercoder reliability is key. And I'll tell you more about intercoder reliability on the next slide. And finally, quantitative. Analysis is conducted according to operationalized definitions which quantify the results. So again, analysis is objective because analysis falls into these very specific categories and it's not left open to interpretation. We want something that is so explicitly defined that whether you see it, I see it, or someone else sees it, we know what we're counting. That is a perfect content analysis if we can set that up in such a way. Now, where things get iffy is when we use things, like value-laden terms, something that's good, bad, evil characters. Those things can get very tricky. So in some cases, we want to replace those terms with something that is more concrete, that is something where there's no element left up to interpretation. We don't want to necessarily insinuate motives or try and divine whether something is intrinsically good or bad, the value placed on something. That generally doesn't work within a content analysis. What we want to do is we want to refine our questions, our units of analyses down to something that is more basic than something that could be politically, socially, or, I don't know, maybe even religiously biased. Okay? So, systematic, objective, and quantitative. So, here are the basic steps in content analysis. And I believe you can find this on page 163 and following. First, formulate your research questions or hypotheses. Now, I can't stress this enough. Do not just pull something out of the air and go, here's what I want to look at. In defining your research questions or hypotheses, what you should do is kind of have a vague idea in your mind and then go out and see what other people have done. You might find that someone has already done the exact study that you're doing. Now, you could replicate that. That's okay. But you want to know that this study has been done before. You might find that someone has already answered your question, or maybe numerous people have, and they have definitively disproven a hypothesis that you might have. At that point, jumping in there and spending all the time to do the content analysis may actually be a waste of your time. So, research questions and hypotheses, we want to make sure that they are grounded in something other than our gut feelings. Second, define the universe in question, the boundaries of the study. Now, it's often very enticing for a researcher, especially a new researcher, to want to solve all the world's problems. But that's generally not that's not possible, and it's not a good mindset for doing something like this. What you want to do is you want to limit your study to specifically something that you can handle. So, for example, if I were trying to talk about, say, Asian American representation in television, I probably don't want to just say Asian American images in television broadly. That is a huge topic to focus on. What I may want to do is specifically quantify, or specifically focus on, rather, sitcoms or commercials or dramas or soap operas. And then maybe next time I do another content analysis in another genre of TV. And I keep taking little bites out of Asian American representations in TV. But instead of trying to do this giant study that incorporates all of television, I limit it down to something that might be easier to define, where my parameters are more manageable. This goes into number 3. Select an appropriate sample for your population. Excuse me. So what do I mean by select an appropriate sample for your population? 2 things. One, you want to make sure that the thing you're choosing items from is appropriate to your sample. It's internally valid. Am I looking at something that I should be looking at to answer the question that I'm supposed to answer? For example, a student a few semesters ago decided that she wanted to do a study that looked at television representations of female protagonists as written by males versus females. Okay, all right, that's an interesting study, a little bit broad, but what we kind of hammered out as we were talking about this is that she would find one sitcom that had exclusively male writers with a female protagonist, and another sitcom that had exclusively female writers with a female protagonist. Now, we had to go beyond that, though. We had to actually see, are these female protagonists in similar situations? Are they both married? Are they both unmarried? Are they both relatively the same age? Are they going through similar situations? Because all of these could affect the way that the actual writers of the sitcom depict the female protagonist. So we wanted to try and get as much apples to apples as we could get in this study. So we want to make sure that we get it appropriate for the population. The second thing that I mean by appropriate for the population is of a particular size. Now, this one can get iffy. So what we want to get is a sample that is large enough to be representative of the population. Now, if we are talking about these 2 sitcoms, and we want to compare these, what we would want to do is get a sample from one sitcom and a sample from another. A single episode is not enough to do this type of study, even though we might get a lot of data from a single episode. What we want to do is actually think, okay, how many seasons is this show? How many episodes is in a season? And how many episodes do we need to get in order to justify, or in order to generalize our results to the greater population, which is the series as a whole, as opposed to just one season or one episode. Now, in this case, what we decided to do was do an entire season of one show and an entire season of another show. Honestly, that may be a little bit too big if the series itself is only 5 seasons long. We're talking about 1/5 of the whole population. That's usually pretty big. What I would suggest, if you're ever concerned with how large your sample should be, is go online and look up sample calculators. There's any number of calculators both online and free apps that are available on your phone that give you an estimate of how many items would generally be considered a sample for different levels of certainty, like 90% certainty or 95% certainty or 99% certainty. Each of these have different requirements regarding the size of your sample. Now we'll talk more about this a little bit later on in the class when we talk about p-values and levels of certainty. But for now, just understand we need something that is appropriate for the sample or appropriate for the population, both in kind and in number. Finally, select and define the units of analysis. This goes back to what we were talking about before. What are the things you are specifically looking for, and what are the things you're measuring? Okay, so these are the same thing. This is the unit of analysis. So if it is Asian American representations, then we are looking at specific occurrences of Asian Americans within those shows. Now, we could break this down further. We could talk about female representation and male representation, kid representation. We could break down Asian American representation into very specific stereotypes and how often they appear. There's any number of things we could do, but all of those qualify as units of analysis. Next, construct categories of content to be analyzed. This connects with what we talked about just a second ago. So how do we separate the content? How do we categorize it in a way that makes it more manageable? Moving on into number 6, establish a quantification system. In other words, how are we going to count them? How are we going to mark down the times we see this? How are we going to then do the appropriate math and sum out all of our results? Are we going to use paper, or are we going to use a computer system? Are we going to create different categories that will all be quantified separately, or are we going to be pooling results? All of these are things to consider when you're talking about your quantification system. Next, and this is where things kind of get iffy or get difficult sometimes for students who want to run content analysis. Train coders and conduct a pilot study. This is invaluable. Coders are the ones that generally will be doing the content analysis. Now, you can be a coder of your own content analysis. That's fine. But understand this, you are most likely to include at least a little bit of research bias into your content analysis if you're one of your own coders. There's almost no way that you can do that. You can avoid this. You know exactly what you mean in a particular unit analysis or a particular category of analysis. You know what you're talking about. Others may not. So while you may interpret data one way and think this is the proper way of interpreting it, you may not be defining things in an appropriate way so that someone else might be able to do this. So it's sometimes better to find 2 completely unique coders, or maybe 3 coders if you're going to include yourself, you plus 2 more, and then to see how the different results stack up. Now, I've got a very, very simple example of how this reliability works a little bit later on. But for now, here's the thing that I want you to understand. We have simple ways of doing intercoder reliability for small content analyses, but the larger you get, the more you sometimes will need to use more complex methods. Now, more complex methods of establishing intercoder reliability, which we will talk about in its own section a little bit later on, these will actually require you just to take a sample of the sample, maybe like 10% of the sample that you have, and then run it through a formula to see what type of agreement you have between coder A, coder B, coder C, that kind of thing. And then you have certain levels, like say if you get 80% or higher, you're good to go. So there's different ways of establishing intercoder reliability, and generally the larger the population is, the larger your sample needs to be, and the larger your sample is, the more complex ways you need to generally complete intercoder reliability. Okay, let's go ahead and move on at this point. Number 8, code the content according to the established definitions. This is pretty straightforward. Once you've gotten all of your units of analysis defined and operationalized, once you've established your quantification system, once you've trained your coders, run your pilot study, made sure that they are in agreement on the top or on the subjects and the unit of analyses, everything seems to work, you've refined your categories, then go ahead and code your content according to the definitions that you have created. Next, analyze the collected data. Of course, after you collect it, then analyze it. And there's any number of ways you can analyze the data. We'll talk about that much later in this class. Finally, draw conclusions and search for indications. Now, at this point, once we see the indications of what is going on, or once we see the data related to what is going on, then we can draw conclusions about overall what is happening, and then maybe start looking for other research that might indicate why this is happening. Now, content analysis is a very, very poor method for establishing why something is happening. It is only valuable for establishing what is occurring. Okay? I want to make that very, very clear. We aren't getting into any of the whys. We are specifically looking at the whats at this point. So let's talk about reliability in particular. Most reliability in a content analysis is established before the official study. This goes back to what we talked about before. In that initial training of coders and that pilot study, this is where you generally will establish reliability. Now, when you establish reliability, we'll go through this one more time. You define the category boundaries with the maximum amount of detail you possibly can. Again, you want to define this in such a way as you could hand your study to someone who has never seen it before, has no idea of any of the theory or any of the stuff that goes into developing the categories, and they would be able to look at your sample and count the things that you want them to count. Okay? That is the ideal situation for a content analysis. Now, that takes time, it takes some planning, sometimes it takes a little bit of cleverness to get things that way, but that's what we're shooting for. Okay? Next, you train your coders. So, you may bring your coders in, you may give them little samples of what you're talking about, see how they do. If they're spot on, then we can move on to a pilot study, let them do a small scale sample, maybe 20 items, and see how they work out. If you give them 1 or 2 and they seem to have some disagreement, well, at that point, figure out if it's a problem with your definitions, with your units of analysis, with maybe your coders' understanding of the units of analysis, and see if it's something that the coders have a problem with or your study has a problem with. Okay? So either of those could potentially be the issue that you're dealing with. Finally, conduct your pilot study. Conduct a small-scale version of the study and this will allow you to work out any kind of kinks that you might have before the official study. So, again, if I have, say, 200 items in the official study, I may want to give my coders, say, a small sample of 20 items to code and see how they work out those 20. If they're doing well with that, if everything is solid and they are in high agreement, then great, we can move on. If there's problems, we should be able to spot them pretty quick and then go back and address it. Don't be afraid to modify your categories. This is where you do it. A lot of students find themselves getting in a lot of trouble because they almost get emotionally attached to the work they've done in these categories. They say, well, anybody should understand what I'm talking about, or maybe I've defined these cleverly enough as is, and I don't have time. I've got to move forward. Well, the problem is once you get into your full-scale study and you've spent maybe weeks letting your coders get through all of the data, or I'm sorry, all of the sample items, then you get the data back and run your agreeability or reliability tests. At that point, you might find that you have tremendous problems with reliability, and the data you have is pretty much useless. That is a terrible situation to be in because that sends you all the way back to the beginning where you should have made sure that you had high intercoder reliability right off the bat. So just kind of keep that in mind. Now, here's an example of how intercoder reliability might be dealt with. So if we're looking at, say, what we see within a particular TV show, and we're looking for, in this case, 5 different items: abusive language, sexual innuendo, inappropriate gaze, unwanted romantic attention, and sexual touch. And let's just assume for a second that we have meticulously defined each of these categories, and everything seems pretty solid. If we go in and say these A, B, C, D, and E are Roberto's, and these are Maria's, and we see that Maria and Roberto both end up with the exact same number, in this case 20. They see 20 items in each, 20 items in each. If we can go in and actually see that they are agreeing like this, that's fine, but there's a problem with this. The problem is that Maria's 20 and Roberto's 20 may not actually be the same 20. Now, in a small scale study, if you're not doing a huge content analysis, you may be able to very quickly decide or figure out where those numbers are coming from. But we've got issues here where Roberto may be getting extra numbers from unwanted romantic, or Maria may be getting extra numbers from unwanted romantic attention. She's got 6 of those. Well, Roberto only saw 3. Well, that's a problem. They both have 20, but they're different 20. They found different numbers. This is one of the most common problems that students have when they do a content analysis. They just total up all the numbers and go, well, it's the same number, or it's within, or it's 80% the same number, 90% the same number. So if one person found 20 and the other person found 25, they go, hey, look, intercoder reliability, life is good. Well, in this particular case, this is actually not a very good content analysis. We see very similar numbers, but in very different categories across the board. So I believe your book talks about several different methods for establishing intercoder reliability. One that I've used many times is called Krippendorf's alpha, and it's one that you would break down according to each of the individual categories and go abusive language to abusive language. What are we seeing? Sexual innuendo to a sexual innuendo. What are we seeing? Inappropriate gaze to inappropriate gaze. What are we seeing? And you would break it down and see how each one of those categories actually matches up. So we wouldn't just do grand total versus grand total. We would look category by category and see how our coders matched. So if you can do that, if you can go through all of this information or go through all of these steps you're probably going to have a pretty decent content analysis. They're not hard to do, but you have to be very meticulous when you go through it. And in fact, I think they're a lot of fun once you get into them, and you can find some really, really interesting things. So if you have any questions, as always, contact me, let me know, and I'll answer them any way I can as soon as I can reply to you. As always, I'm Dr. Casey Hart, and I'll see you next time.